Welcome to Horrific Stories. Today's tale is a terrifying journey filled with suspense and chilling twists. If you love horror, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. In the small fog-shrouded town of Hollow Hills, Halloween was more than just costumes and candy. Each October, as leaves drifted down like embers, a peculiar heaviness filled the air, and strange happenings haunted the community. The townsfolk said it was because of the old Hollow House, a decrepit mansion that loomed on the edge of town, steeped in dark tales and harrowing history. The old Hollow House, abandoned for nearly a century, was once the home of the Blackwood family, a wealthy lineage with a dark past. In 1901, the entire family disappeared overnight without a trace. Legends claimed the Blackwoods were cursed, and on Halloween, whispers spoke of ghostly figures appearing in the windows, eerie lights flickering in empty rooms, and strange noises that would echo from within. One Halloween night, a group of 5 teenagers, Rachel, Mike, Andy, Sarah, and Tom, decided to break into the old Hollow House, daring each other to stay until midnight. They weren't believers in ghosts or curses. It was all nonsense to them. But they loved the thrill of fear and the challenge that came with it. As the group approached the old house, they noticed that the air seemed to grow colder with each step. The towering iron gates, rusted and tangled with vines, creaked as they pushed through. The house loomed above, its windows dark like empty eye sockets in a skull, staring down at them. Andy, the fearless one, led the way. He had brought a flashlight and a pack of candles. "Just in case the ghosts need some mood lighting," he joked, trying to ease the tension. As they stepped inside, the heavy wooden doors creaked ominously, and a musty, cold draft greeted them. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs draped the halls like haunted lace. The kids began exploring, taking turns daring each other to check different rooms. They laughed at every squeak and groan the house made, calling out to the spirits to come out and play. They passed through a grand hallway adorned with tarnished portraits of the Blackwood family members. Each painting seemed to follow their every move with dead, glassy eyes. Rachel felt a shiver crawl up her spine, and could have sworn that one of the paintings, a somber woman in a tattered dark dress, blinked. When the clock struck 11, they found themselves in the parlor, where a grand, dusty piano stood, its keys untouched for decades. A sudden urge overtook Sarah, who was musically inclined, and she walked over to the piano. Just as she ran her fingers over the keys, the air grew colder, and the faint notes seemed to echo longer than they should have. Then came the whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind. But as the voices grew louder, they realized it was something else entirely. Soft murmurs, impossible to ignore. It sounded like a family quarrel, angry voices hissing and yelling. The kids froze, their hearts pounding. They exchanged nervous glances, each one daring the other to explain the sounds. "Maybe it's just the pipes," Mike whispered, trying to steady himself, but even he didn't believe it. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from every direction, wrapping around them like a cold, invisible mist. Just as Andy reached for his flashlight to leave, the lights suddenly flickered on, though no electricity had run through the old house for years. The lamps cast a dim, unsettling glow, illuminating the dusty room, and just behind them, a door creaked open. Rachel, braver than she felt, stepped forward. She peeked into the room beyond, her flashlight illuminating an old dining table set with silverware, plates, and half-full goblets, untouched as though the family had just left. But what made her blood run cold was a dusty handwritten note, scrawled across one of the plates, reading, "You are not welcome here." "Let's leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. But as they turned to go, the door they had entered through slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Mike grabbed the handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. His heart sank as he realized they were trapped. And then, They saw it. A figure in the hallway standing at the top of the stairs, a pale woman in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by shadows. She stood still as stone, watching them with hollow eyes. The teenagers froze, paralyzed by terror. Without warning, the woman began gliding down the stairs, her movements impossibly smooth, like she was floating. Her face came into the dim light, revealing empty, blackened eye sockets and a twisted, cruel smile. The kids stumbled back, their legs heavy with fear. "Run!" Andy yelled, snapping them out of their stupor. But the figure blocked their path, and the whispers grew louder, turning into agonized screams. They retreated into the parlor, where the only escape was an old, rickety window. As they desperately tried to pry it open, the room seemed to come alive. Shadows twisted and danced, forming shapes that reached out, almost as if they wanted to pull the teenagers back into the house forever. Rachel felt something cold graze her arm and looked down to see a bony handprint forming on her skin. She screamed, and with a final desperate push, they broke the window and tumbled out into the night air, scrambling and tripping over each other as they ran toward the gate. When they finally stopped, panting and gasping, they looked back at the old hollow house. In one of the upstairs windows, the figure in black stood watching them, her hollow eyes fixed on their retreating forms. No one spoke a word on the way home. By the time they reached the safety of their homes, each of them felt that they'd left a piece of themselves in that house. Years later, on Halloween night, Hollow Hills residents would sometimes hear whispers coming from the old hollow house, and those brave enough to walk up to the gates claimed they'd seen a group of ghostly teenagers running down the driveway, screaming, chased by a dark figure in a black dress. And as the town grew older, the house remained, waiting for the next group of daring souls, the whispers inside promising that no one would ever truly leave the old hollow house. They called it Asterisk the Devil's Grove Asterisk. The forest, dense and sprawling, lay on the edge of Middleton, a town with a history of unsolved disappearances. People avoided it, especially on Halloween night when the shadows grew longer, and a chilling stillness enveloped the trees. But this Halloween, a group of 4 thrill-seekers, Eva, Ben, Lauren, and Mark, wanted to face the town's fears and explore the heart of the grove, searching for any truth to the eerie tales they'd heard all their lives. The stories were ominous. Some said the trees themselves were cursed, that anyone who went deep enough into the grove would see things that would haunt them for life. Others whispered of a supernatural force lurking within, waiting for those foolish enough to disturb it. The friends brushed off these warnings. They packed flashlights, snacks, and an old camera that Lauren's grandfather had used in his ghost hunting days. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, they made their way to the entrance of the forest as the sun sank below the horizon. The woods were already dark, and the sounds of nature grew quieter as they ventured further inside. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, dancing and shifting as if alive, and the usual forest scents of moss and damp leaves gave way to a metallic tang that made their skin prickle. As they ventured deeper, the fog rolled in, thick and soupy, swirling around their legs and obscuring the ground beneath their feet. "It's just fog," Mark muttered, trying to break the tension, but no one laughed. The fog was so dense they could barely see each other's faces. Then they heard it, a faint, distant cry that sounded like a child's voice, pleading for help. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice a whisper, his face pale in the glow of his flashlight. "It's just the wind," Ava replied, though even she didn't believe it. But the cries grew louder, a strange echo carrying through the trees. Something about the voice was wrong. It wasn't just a cry. There was an odd metallic rasp to it, as if something was mimicking human sounds but didn't quite understand them. The group huddled together, their flashlights scanning the trees which seemed to close in on them, branches twisting like skeletal fingers. And then, just a few feet ahead, they spotted something, a small figure standing motionless in the fog. "Hello?" Lauren called out, stepping forward, her voice wavering. But the figure didn't respond. It remained still, almost as if it were waiting. The friends approached, their footsteps tentative, hearts pounding. As they got closer, they could make out more details. The figure was a small child, no older than 6 or 7, dressed in a tattered white nightgown, her face obscured by the shadows. But when she finally lifted her head, they froze. Her eyes were pitch black, voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched, and her mouth hung open in an unnatural, silent scream. As they stood paralyzed, the child's lips began to move, though no sound came out. Then, without warning, she lifted a hand and pointed deeper into the forest, her gaze fixed on them with an intensity that chilled them to the bone. Ben grabbed Ava's hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go back. Now." But as they turned to leave, they saw more figures emerging from the fog, stepping between the trees, silent and still, all staring with those hollow black eyes. There were dozens of them now, men, women, and children of all ages, their faces twisted into expressions of silent terror. "Run!" Mark shouted, breaking the group's paralysis. They sprinted back the way they had come, but the forest seemed to shift around them. Paths that should have led out of the grove twisted and turned, leading them deeper in. The fog thickened, and the figures kept appearing, emerging from the trees and surrounding them, their lifeless eyes following their every move. Lauren stopped, her voice shaking. This is wrong. We should be out by now." Ava turned to her, desperation in her voice. "Keep running." The group ran, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the silent forest, but the figures were relentless, appearing on every path. Exhausted, the friends stopped to catch their breath, only to realize that the grove was completely silent. No birds, no crickets, just an unnatural, deafening silence. Then came the whispers. They started soft, a hissing sound that grew louder and more insistent, wrapping around them like tendrils of smoke. They could make out their own names, spoken in voices they didn't recognize, over and over. Lauren was the first to break. She screamed and ran blindly into the darkness, ignoring her friends' calls. They chased after her, but she vanished into the fog, her scream echoing through the trees before abruptly cutting off. The remaining 3 were frantic. They called out for Lauren, but only silence answered. Suddenly, Ben noticed something on the ground. A doll, old and faded, with a cracked porcelain face, lying just where Lauren had disappeared. His heart raced as he picked it up, recognizing the torn white nightgown as the same one the first figure wore. "Lauren!" he called, clutching the doll, his voice breaking. Then Ava pointed toward a distant tree. "Look!" Carved into the trunk was a single chilling sentence. "No one leaves." As they stared, a cold wind began to swirl around them, and the figures grew closer, forming a circle. Their black eyes seemed to glow, and their mouths opened, filling the forest with an unholy wailing that drilled into their skulls. Ben, Ava, and Mark ran, blindly crashing through the trees, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They didn't stop until they burst out of the forest, stumbling and collapsing onto the grass, their bodies scraped and bruised. But when they looked back, they realized they were missing someone. Mark, who had been running right behind them, was nowhere to be seen. In his place lay another doll, wearing Mark's jacket. A sickening dread filled Ava's stomach. They tried to go back, to save him, but the forest's entrance had disappeared entirely. There was no path, just an impenetrable wall of trees and fog. Years passed, and the survivors never spoke of what happened in the Devil's Grove. But every Halloween, they would hear whispers outside their windows, calling their names in raspy voices that sounded just a little too familiar. And they knew that somewhere deep within those cursed woods, their friends, Lauren and Mark, were still waiting, transformed by the forest into silent, watching figures doomed to wander the grove forever. And so, the warning remained. Do not enter the Devil's Grove. Those who go in never truly leave. The town of Ashbrook Hollow was small, almost forgotten, nestled in a valley shrouded in mist and thick woods. Among the locals, there was one place that no one dared to approach, the Ashbrook Manor, an ancient, rotting mansion that loomed at the edge of town. Abandoned for nearly a century, the house was a place of superstition, mystery, and deep, lingering dread. Every year, on Halloween night, strange lights would appear in the windows, casting an eerie glow that looked like distant, burning embers. Shadows would twist and dance across the walls, and on particularly quiet nights, townsfolk claimed to hear faint music drifting from the manor, a slow, haunting melody that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But the most disturbing thing of all was the rumor that once you stepped inside the house, you'd never leave the same. Still, a group of local kids decided this Halloween would be different. They wanted to be the ones who braved the Ashbrook Manor, who uncovered its secrets. Jake, Tessa, Luke, and Emma, 4 friends with a taste for adventure, promised to spend the night in the manor, proving that the tales were just the product of overactive imaginations. They arrived at Ashbrook Manor at midnight. The moon was full, casting a pale glow over the towering, dilapidated structure. The windows, covered in grime, looked like empty eyes, and the wood groaned under the weight of decades of rot and abandonment. "This is it," Jake whispered, though his voice betrayed his nerves. They pushed the door open with a loud creak, stepping into the entryway. Dust filled the air, settling on them like a shroud. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the wallpaper had peeled away to reveal the decaying wood beneath. Their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long shadows across the warped floorboards. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the unmistakable smell of something rotting. But there was another scent, too, faint and sickly sweet, like flowers left to die. Tessa shivered. "It's just an old house," Luke said, though he didn't sound convinced. They began exploring room by room. The manor had once been grand. Marble fireplaces, ornate chandeliers, intricately carved banisters. But time had not been kind. The furniture was draped in filthy sheets, and the floors creaked under their weight. They found a parlor, a dining room, a library, all frozen in time, as though the house's last inhabitants had simply vanished. As they entered what appeared to be a ballroom, the temperature dropped. Tessa rubbed her arms, trying to shake the chill. The ballroom was large, with high, arched ceilings and an enormous cracked mirror at one end. As they stood there, the oppressive silence settled around them, thick and heavy. And then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the room. It was slow, like footsteps pacing back and forth. The friends looked at each other, eyes wide, and shone their flashlights toward the sound. But there was nothing there. "Probably an animal," Jake said, though his voice was shaky. Just then, the faint strains of music began to play, drifting through the air like a phantom melody. It was coming from the old gramophone in the corner, which was covered in dust. The turntable began to spin, crackling to life as the haunting melody filled the room. "That's impossible," Emma whispered, taking a step back. Then they noticed something else. Figures, barely visible, appearing in the mirror. They were faint, like smudges on glass. But as the friends stared, the shapes became clearer. Men and women in elegant, old-fashioned clothes, waltzing to the music, their faces blank and expressionless. The friends backed away, horrified, but their eyes were drawn to the figures, mesmerized and horrified all at once. The dancers moved in a slow, otherworldly rhythm, gliding across the floor, their bodies moving as though suspended in water. And then, one by one, they stopped and turned to face the friends, their dark, hollow eyes fixed on them. The music stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The figures in the mirror froze, but their eyes continued to follow the friends. Then, as if on some unseen signal, the ghostly figures began to step out of the mirror, slipping into the ballroom, their faces twisted with anger and sorrow. "Run!" Jake screamed, snapping the others out of their daze. They bolted, tearing through the dark hallways as the figures pursued them, their footsteps echoing ominously. The air grew thick, almost solid, making it hard to breathe. They reached the staircase, but as they tried to descend, the stairs stretched, lengthening before their eyes, twisting into a seemingly endless descent. In a panic, they turned, only to see the figures approaching, their faces contorted with rage. The friends raced down the hallway, finding themselves back in the entryway. They pushed open a door, but instead of leading outside, it opened onto another room, one they hadn't seen before. Inside was a table set for 4. The plates were covered in dust, and 4 empty chairs awaited them. A faint, nauseating smell wafted from the plates, as if they had been left out for decades. Why is there a table set?" Tessa stammered, fear tightening her chest. Just then, the door behind them slammed shut, and a lock clicked ominously. The room grew colder, and they could hear a voice, a low, rasping whisper that sounded like it was coming from every corner. "Sit," it commanded. Paralyzed with fear, the friends stared at each other, but something compelled them forward, like an invisible hand pulling them toward the table. Against their will, they sat down, each feeling a suffocating dread closing in. The shadows in the room shifted, swirling and growing denser until they took on solid forms, the ghostly figures from the mirror, standing just behind each friend. One by one, the figures placed their icy hands on the friends' shoulders, their hollow eyes boring into them. Then, as if on cue, the plates before them began to fill with food. It looked like a meal straight out of a fancy dinner party, meats, breads, wine, but each dish was rotting, covered in mold and crawling with insects. "Eat," the voice whispered. The friends tried to resist, but their hands moved against their will, bringing the foul food to their mouths. The taste was beyond anything they could describe, rotting, putrid, death. They gagged and choked, but they couldn't stop. The shadows loomed closer, and the figures behind them began to whisper in their ears. Fragments of memories, regrets, confessions of crimes they'd committed. And as each friend was forced to eat, they felt pieces of themselves slipping away, as though the house was devouring their very souls. With one final desperate effort, Emma broke free, shoving her chair back and stumbling to her feet. The spell was broken, and the others followed, bolting for the door, their hearts pounding with terror. They ran, not daring to look back, as the whispers and footsteps pursued them down the hall. They burst out of the manor, gasping for breath, feeling the cold night air hit their faces like a splash of water. But when they looked back, the house was dark and silent, as though nothing had happened. They left Ashbrook Hollow that night, vowing never to return. But they didn't leave unscathed. In the days that followed, each friend began to change. They grew distant, haunted, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. Shadows flickered in their homes, and faint music would play in the dead of night, a ghostly reminder of what they had endured. And every Halloween, no matter how far they went, they would find themselves drawn back to the Ashbrook Manor, standing outside its gates, hearing the faint whispers calling them, inviting them back to finish their meal. Thanks for watching. Horrific Stories. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling stories. Until next time, keep your lights on and your fears closed.